Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Nichols-Boyle. So, what I wanted to do was give you a bit of a close reading example with the paragraph we had to do for last week, which was the comparison of how Bell and Carlton talk about the Wake and Irish education. So, I wanted to see some of you already got some of them, pulling out some of the quotes that you used, and then going into it a little bit deeper and giving you some more context about the history and seeing what Bell was missing here. So I think this will help you see a little bit more about how you can use the quotes and language to analyze it, and also to give you some more context for what Bell is lacking in terms of the understanding about the situation. So we'll start with the wake. Um, Many of you pulled out one section that was a little bit before the main description of the wake, and people quoted this part here about the Irish that Bell says. And he says, "There is this strange peculiarity in the character of the native Irish, that in occasions of great joy and merriment they indulge themselves in grief and melancholy, and under circumstances of mourning and sorrow they ran headlong into the most extravagant mirth." So this idea here that they have the wrong kinds of reactions naturally, that it's just strange, right? So this strange peculiarity because he doesn't understand it. The idea that they're going to be happy at a funeral and sad at a wedding, right? But I think we can all see this idea that they will often cry at weddings because they're so happy, right? And you might be happy at a wake in order to celebrate the life and instead of mourning it. Although, as he mentions, they do seem to go in between the two. So then we go into more his main description of the wake, which happens mostly at the bottom of 74 and to the very top of 75. So he's talking about the merriment enjoyed at the Irish wake. And he talks about the games that happened there, and then that seemingly to him, they just seem to take a short break from these games and this fun and storytelling and things to interrupt every hour or half hour by the cries of those who sat next to the deceased, and last in 5 or 6 minutes to mourn and then go back. So to him, this seems very fake, right? In the way that he's describing it, we can see that if we look at the language. And again, there were games around the wake, but these were mostly for the entertainment of children. And again, it was a 3-day long celebration. And many of you noted that maybe he's noting that there is a celebration here. But in the tone and in the way that he's describing it, as we'll see when we look at some of these quotes, he's not saying that in a positive way, right? So he is describing it in these kind of negative terms, and he's lacking that sort of context, and that it wasn't necessarily just that everyone involved in having this great fun, but that they were also celebrating the life as well as mourning the death of this person. So when he starts talking about the way that they mourn every 5 or 6 minutes per hour or something, he talks about these cries. These cries have been described by the appellation, or the name, of the Irish howl, and shocking as they would have been to a delicate English ear, they were not destitute of modulation. So right here, we can see he's describing it as a howl. And as some of you noted, that's a bit of an animalistic term, right? People don't really howl. Dogs do, wolves do, right? Animals. So this idea that it's very naturalistic, kind of beneath it, and not a really human reaction, it's sort of fake, is odd. And again, he describes it as being shocking to a delicate English ear. So he's English, right? So the English are delicate and sophisticated, right? The Irish are howling, right? And even then he says, but it was not destitute of modulation, which means it still had some kind of rhythm and enjoyment to it, right? It's just not, it's not our level, but it's still there. And this, when it was very rhythmic, and this was a ritual, the wake. So you would have heard it kind of like, oh, oh, that kind of thing So it would have been very dramatic, but it was part of the ritual to do this. And he says the voices of women always predominated. While they were crying or howling, they frequently repeated a set of unmeaning words and would ask the deceased why he was so cruel as to leave them. So this part here, too, again, Belle doesn't know this, but Belle doesn't know Irish. So this was set words that you would say in Irish or Gaelic in order to be part of the ritual. So there was this kind of common phraseology that would be used. It would say, my love, willaloo, willaloo, this kind of crying thing that would say, why are you so horrible as to leave me? Please come back to me, my love. I can't believe you've left me. Why were you so cruel? Why were you so cruel? And it would just kind of repeat like that. But it's not unmeaning. He just doesn't understand it, right? He doesn't know the ritual and he doesn't know Irish. So he doesn't really see why they're doing this. And he also says many women who had never been related to nor acquainted with the deceased would join in the howl with every appearance of affliction, would beat their bosoms, dishevel their hair, and bedew their faces with tears. The same woman would perhaps, in 10 minutes after, take a leading part in the mirth which succeeded. And then he mentions it was often been said that persons were hired to cry at wakes and funerals. And he said, I can't deny it, but he never knew an instance of the kind. So he's trying to kind of undercut that idea. But you can tell by the way he's describing it here that 10 minutes later, they are happy that he doesn't feel like this grief is genuine, right? And he would say every appearance of affliction, so not that they're really afflicted, and that they would beat their bosoms, mess up their hair, have tears, but he doesn't feel like it's a genuine kind of grief here. So that gives us kind of some sense of what he's saying. Now, if we look at Carleton and his description of the wake, and was focusing specifically on that kind of description of the mourning and the howl, we see something a little bit different. So he's talking about his mother here and her singing. And there's some other things you can pull out of here, but we'll focus on the wake part for now. So he talks about what he calls the keen in Irish, not a howl, right? It has a specific name because it's a ritualistic kind of thing, kind of like a funeral song. There's certain songs you sing at funerals here, right? So he says, perhaps there never lived a human being capable of giving the Irish cry or keen with such exquisite effect, or of pouring into its wild notes a spirit of such irresistible pathos and sorrow. I have often been present when she has raised the keen, his mother, as it is called, over the corpse of some relative or neighbor, and my readers may judge of the melancholy charm which accompanied this expression of her sympathy. When I assure them that the general clamor of violent grief was gradually diminished by admiration, until it became ultimately hushed, and no voice was heard but her own wailing and sorrowful but solitary beauty. That she's so good at the keen and she's so powerful and emotional with it that it made people fall silent, right? They wouldn't even join in. And he says, this pause, it is true, was never long, for however great might be the admiration which she excited, the hearts of those who heard her soon melted, and mere strangers were forced to confess her influence by the tears which she caused them to shed for those whose deaths could in no way have affected them. So he's saying that the emotion of the song here was so strong that people would just be moved by it and they would be crying even if they didn't really know the person or their death didn't affect them, right? So he's seeing that as a positive thing. Whereas Bell talks about this idea of these people not even being hired to cry at wakes, and that they wouldn't even necessarily know the person or that kind of thing, and it's not sincere. Now, people were sometimes hired to cry at wakes or asked to cry at wakes if they didn't know the person. And because of this very reason, like Carleton says, just like we would hire people to sing at a funeral, we want the best singers, right? Even if they don't know the person. So this is, and in a small community, they probably would have at least known people peripherally, and people couldn't travel very easily, so there probably would have been something. But it doesn't mean that the grief isn't genuine, right? That the cry isn't genuine. So what Bell is saying as he's, you know, these strangers, these people are just faking their grief. They're actually engaging in a ritual, and they are doing something that they are very good at, like just like singing. So there's a different kind of context here that he doesn't understand. So there's a couple ways of looking at that. One, he might be being authentic in trying to portray this in an as objective way as his observation is. That this is what he saw, this is what he believed out of it, understandably so, from what he from lacking that extra information. Um, but as an outsider, he doesn't know that, he doesn't have that insider knowledge. He doesn't have that information that would allow him to understand it completely. And part of the thing is, he doesn't ask, right? He keeps that distance and he doesn't find out the meaning behind some of these things. So that's kind of the difference, even if we had good intentions, between seeing it there. And we can see the same thing with the education. So I mentioned that Bell said that they lived in a state of barbarous ignorance. Um, and that might, in some ways, people, I think, said in their descriptions, well, Carlton confirmed this in a way. He confirms that they lived in a state of barbarous ignorance in terms of them not being very well educated. But what I would say is think closely about those words. He does confirm that they lived in a state of ignorance, but not barbarous ignorance. So by using the word barbarous, that comes from the word barbarian, right, or barbaric. And barbarian was considered someone who's, we've never heard that used in a positive way, right? Someone who's uncultured, who's brutish, who's kind of savage. So the implication again is that sort of naturalistic, animalistic idea of that this is the state that they're in, that they don't want to be educated, right? That they live this way because that's kind of who they are. And Carlton is saying, agreeing that they are more ignorant. But I think he would probably object to that idea of being barbarously ignorant. So he gives us a little bit more of that insider information again. And I'll add to this as well, but we can see here, and I think some of you started to see this, in this section on education. It describes Carlton's first experiences at school and the dearth or lack of schoolmasters and teachers. And when he talks about a poor scholar was literally a student who had to rely on the charity of others to pay for his education. Um, as we can see in the final paragraph here, where it talks about these men had daughters, never thought of sending them to boarding schools. Unfortunately, although the Irish did value women in many ways, they valued them for their place in the household, and it held them up like that as an example of family, but not necessarily for education at the time as much. So as he's saying here, and women couldn't, of course, be priests and very rich school teachers, so they were not able to advance in the same way. So women were unlikely to be educated, but a poor scholar was literally a student who had to rely on the charity of others to pay for his education. So if a student showed enough promise, is doing well in the classroom, he could get a letter from the local priest or bishop in the Catholic Church and be sent to the seminaries for training priests in the south of Ireland. And this letter would guarantee that your community would help give everything that they could, that kind of generosity, and people along the way, as you're making your way down there, would put you up for free. And they were in some ways sometimes looked down upon a little bit by especially the teachers, because they weren't getting paid for the person. But it was a matter of status and prestige to teach a poor scholar as well. So a poor scholar would then become a priest or maybe a teacher, and that was one of the very few ways to get an education or status at the time. So as he says here, what's interesting about this description is it describes somebody who really wants to learn, right? And Carlton himself was a poor scholar. He didn't end up going to the priesthood, left that behind, of course, for writing, but he started off this way too. So it was while we lived in Townie, this little township, that I was first sent to school. And he talks about when in one day he learned the alphabet and had gotten as far as starting to spell, beg. I mean, this might be a little bit of exaggeration, but this idea he was just drinking up the knowledge. He really wanted it. And he said the master was Pat Frayne, a Connacht man, or part of um, the country in the Northwest, who had been a poor scholar in his youth. Um, and this was his first day of opening school and also his last. And he had only three scholars: my brother John, a boy named Sam Nelson, and myself. And this disheartened him, and he left the neighborhood and did not reappear for 4 or 5 years. So there weren't enough people going to school to justify him staying. And he says here, indeed, about this period was a most sad and pitiful state in consequence of a dearth of schoolmasters. Education was utterly disregarded by the successive administrations of the day. The unfortunate people consequently had no schools to which they could send their children. It was this condition of education in the North which occasioned so many poor scholars to be sent to the South, where the training schools for priests were, the seminaries, especially to Cary, which is a county in the South. Our neighborhood was now in a most deplorable state with respect to education, or rather the want of it, even though some of them did not send their children to school, the more wealthy. But in general, people wanted an education, but the situation didn't allow it. And there's a couple of reasons for that. For one, some people mentioned they didn't want it because it says education was utterly disregarded by the successive administrations of the day. But by saying that, the administration was not the Irish. The administration was the English, and they didn't want Catholics to be educated. And part of this was because they didn't want them holding on to their own culture, to learning Catholic beliefs, learning Irish, Latin at the time too, through Catholicism, and becoming higher in status and with their own belief system in place. So it was actually one of the laws to not actually even be able to be allowed to be educated as a Catholic. They, a little bit later on, sort of more towards the end of the 1800s, near the end of the 1800s, they did start a public school system, the English, but again, you had to be learning the Protestant religion and Protestant beliefs and English beliefs. So this was the hedge school, they were called, because they were kind of just having them wherever, sometimes like next to a hedge outside, if they didn't have enough school masters or a place to stay, a building, and they didn't necessarily have that information. So it was difficult to get an education. So part of it, the administration, people weren't paying for it. They weren't showing it as a value. So if you wanted an education, you had to take what little money you had, and noticing that you need a lot of people for farming and helping out with that, and give it to the teacher. And teachers were hard to come by, the schoolmasters. So there's a couple of reasons for this. Teachers were hard to come by because it was hard for Irish people to get an education to begin with, right? So there's not that many of them around. And because it was hard to make a living as a school teacher. So you had a couple of issues here. One, the pay, it was whatever people could afford. So sometimes your pay was getting free room and board, something to eat and someplace to stay, or it would be very little money, and you got paid per child, not for the job. So per student. So if you only had 3 students, you're not getting paid enough to stick around, right? And to become a school teacher in the system, because there wasn't this official education system, it's not like today where you would have a training certificate to become a teacher. To become a teacher, you pretty much had to just beat the previous teacher, or if there was nobody around, it set it up, say, I'm a teacher and I'm going to start a school here, if there was not anybody else around. But in general, what you would have to do to become a schoolmaster in an area, if there was somebody already there and you needed a job, was you had to challenge the schoolmaster to a battle of wits. And you would choose the subject, and these were kind of, and then you would have a judge, usually a priest or somebody else who was more educated. Sometimes it would just be kind of common consensus, so it would be kind of playing to the crowd. And you would choose a topic, like say Latin. I will beat you in Latin. And then you would have a battle and say, okay, can you translate this phrase? And say, no, you got that a little bit wrong, or it might be philosophy, and then you would talk about Socrates or Aristotle, and you would debate different theories, and you had to be very quick on your feet, and you had to be able to say you won. So because of this, and if you won, then the previous schoolmaster would just have to leave, and that was that. and you could be challenged at any time as well. And if you lost, then you had to move on and try to find somewhere else to be. So it wasn't a very stable position. And then the other thing is that schoolmasters themselves were very unevenly educated half the time because they would learn, about some subjects and not others, and then they would have to just challenge somebody. So people weren't always getting the best education. So there are all these things added to not necessarily not wanting to have an education, but not being able to get it. And we can kind of see this a little bit in Carlton's description of how much he wanted an education, but the administration wasn't there, the teachers weren't stable, and they just couldn't get what they wanted. So hopefully that helps you get an idea of the kinds of differences between their perspectives and how they're kind of portraying a message, even though they're not directly saying it. And if we pay close attention to that language, how we can contrast and make an argument and see their real meaning behind it.